Hi. MPC Key 37 is the latest hardware version of AKAI's MPC platform, which there are now quite a few of. In this video, I'll take a look at what it's about, how it compares to AKAI's other MPCs and Force, as well as workstations and other synths with a similar form factor. Before I start, a quick disclosure: AKAI sent me MPC Key 37. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Thanks in advance to Boards of Canada for writing this piece and not giving me a copyright strike. Okay, let's start with an overview. The MPC Key 37 isn't just a 37-key version of the MPC Key 61. Otherwise, this would have been a very short video referring you back to my original Key 61 video. Rather, it's kind of a mix between a Key 61 and an MPC 1 Plus. And while pricing may change, assuming it sells for around $900, it makes Key 37 not just an affordable production keyboard/workstation, but also a highly competitive, capable, and portable synth. Despite the price, it doesn't feel cheap or flimsy. The screen and pads seem as per usual for the line, and the enclosure, while plastic, is thick and solid. Before I cover the differences between this and other MPCs, a quick word about what's the same. Key 37 is based on the same operating system and workflow as all of AKAI's other current MPCs, the MPC 1 Plus, MPC Live 2, Key 61, and MPCX. These all can do exactly the same thing in terms of software or operating system. They all just have different physical controls, different memory and connectivity configurations, as well as a different content and plugin bundle. The 7-inch touchscreen display works exactly the same way, except for the MPCX, which has a bigger screen, but the same interface. The screen is multi-touch and very responsive, with very good viewing angles. The sequencing, sampling, and production workflow is the same, except for the AKAI Force, which runs a different variant of the operating system with a few additional features I'll talk about later. All of the current MPCs use the same processor, so there's no difference in CPU power, speed, or polyphony. There is in memory, which I'll talk about. And finally, for the overview, the Key 37 is, as you can probably see, red, but not quite as dark a red as the MPC 1 Plus. Okay, let's dive into the details, and I'll start with the Keybed and first say that you can connect any MIDI keyboard or controller to any other MPC via USB or 5-pin MIDI, and you can still sequence and play any MPC with an external keyboard. They work pretty much the same. That said, if you're planning on predominantly using keys in your production process, then this spread out layout with the keys close to the screen is something you'll appreciate, and the tilted screen here is always welcome regardless. As for the Keybed itself, it seems to me very similar to that of the MPC Key 61. It has, relatively speaking, light action. The Keybed has about 1 centimeter of travel with mono aftertouch, with about, I'd say, 2 millimeters of travel and very good control on the white keys, and maybe a bit under 1 millimeter for the black keys. That seems to require a firmer push. The keys are relatively shorter or not as deep as other synths I have in my studio. I measured this about 13 centimeters, so about a centimeter or half an inch shorter than other Keybeds I have. The Key 61 keys are the same. Both MPC Key versions also come with a mod and pitch bend wheel. They feel pretty much the same except for the cool backlight on the Key 61. As you can see, you've got 3 octaves, which you can shift, 4 octaves, up and down. Moving on, AKAI have added quite a few buttons on the panel compared to most other MPCs. The MPCX still remains king in terms of number of buttons, and the MPC Live 2 has the fewest number of buttons, and this and the Key 61 are even more generous in buttons than the MPC 1. Many of the extra buttons in the key versions of the MPCs are more keyboard oriented. I already mentioned the octave transpose buttons. You've got a dedicated arpeggiator button with a dedicated latch button. There's also a fun and easy to access chord mode, which you program by pressing Shift, pressing the chord you want to program, and chord, and that chord will be transposed across the keybed. Another important keyboard-related function is the keyboard control button. This lets you edit a few settings, including what the different pedals do. The button selection on key 37 is similar to that of key 61, except that the 37 doesn't have the event, locate, and start and end buttons. In what I think is a very welcome move, important buttons have been relocated to under the screen, which is ideal since the MPC workflow requires frequent use of the touchscreen. The only minor complaint that I have about these buttons, and that's probably more of a me problem, is that there are 6 of them, just like the 6 tabs on various synths or other elements of the user interface. So sometimes when I want to press one of these, I end up pressing one of these. But hopefully over time I'll get used to not doing that. A noteworthy difference between the key 37 and the 61, the buttons on the 61 have backlit labels and are more pleasant to the touch as opposed to the relatively clicky buttons here. New to key 37 and 61 is the sounds button. You can still access sounds on the other MPCs with a touchscreen button, and this supports key ranges as well. This lets you quickly create keyboard ranges if you want, with splits and layers, so definitely shots fired at workstation keyboards. And by the way, with undo, which unfortunately many instruments ignore. More about the buttons, the placement of shift could seem as a reason for concern because it's far away from many other buttons that shift, but with MPCs, you can just double click a button to get to its shift function if that's available, of course. And as you may have noticed, the shift option changes the button color, which is pretty cool. Same goes for if you have automation on or off. Anyway, a very generous selection of buttons and I think very well placed and compact. Next up, the MPC Key 37 doesn't have a touch strip, neither do any of the other MPCs except the MPC Key 61 and the controller-only MPC Studio Mark II. It would certainly have been nice to have that here because it's pretty useful. The touch strip can be used for note repeats, to control the touch effects, or to replace one of the cue links. Like all MPCs, you do get the touch effects effect. You just have to use the screen to control it. Moving on, connectivity and the number of inputs and outputs is an important aspect of MPCs. Key 37 has a single stereo output mirrored to the headphone jack, which is a shame because it means you can't get the metronome in your headphones only. Also, the headphone output is on the back compared to better placement on the front on some MPCs. This also has only 2 regular 1/4-inch line inputs. On other MPCs, you might find XLR inputs or more than 2 inputs. You've got a single USB type A jack as opposed to 2 on some other MPCs. These can be used for storage or connecting to an audio or MIDI interface. Then there's a USB type B jack, regular USB 2 as opposed to USB 3 on some other MPCs. But this does do something new that all other MPCs don't. It supports MIDI over USB using 2 new MIDI ports, again through the USB type B jack in the back. That's actually a pretty big deal if you want to sequence external gear. It's another port that you can connect to a computer or iPad without forcing you to use 5-pin MIDI, or in cases that the USB type A port is busy or doesn't work for that device. For those connecting to modular gear, Key 37 has 4 TRS CV jacks. That is as opposed to 8 outputs on some other MPCs. The 4 outputs actually support 8 CV gate outputs if you buy optional breakout cables, but obviously it would be more convenient to not have to buy these and to have 8 outputs. And then there's 5-pin MIDI in and out, but no through. I mentioned earlier keyboard control that relates to the sustain, foot switch 2, and expression jacks that only the Key 37 and Key 61 have. Finally, for connectivity, Key 37 doesn't have an Ethernet network jack, but it, like all current MPCs, but not the old ones, supports Bluetooth MIDI and Wi-Fi connectivity for firmware updates, content downloads, and sync with Ableton Link. Other MPCs can also sync with Ableton Live over Wi-Fi. At least as of the current firmware, I don't see the Ableton Live control button here, so assume that this can't control Ableton Live. Let's move on and talk about storage. When looking at MPCs, there are 3 types of storage or memory you need to consider. There's RAM, meaning memory for the currently active project. That's this guy here. You use this when you load up samples or plug in instruments that require samples. Then there's onboard storage, the internal drive. This has 32 gigabytes of internal storage, of which you can see about 22 are free. I didn't put much here. And then there's how you can expand it. So you can expand MPC Key 37, unlike 61, by the way, with an SD card. It has an SD card slot in the back, so I've got a 128 gig card in the back here, or using the USB port, which this has one of, or with something that the MPC Key 37 doesn't have, but some others have, with an SSD expansion bay in the bottom. If you want to download or install any plugins, by the way, it's going to ask you for external storage, either the SD card or USB. I recommend using the SD card for that, so that the USB Type-A jack remains free to connect to, say, a MIDI controller or USB audio interface. So that's the internal drive. In terms of RAM memory, meaning memory for samples or instruments in a single project, this has 2 gigs, of which about 1 gigabyte is free. That's less than some other MPCs like the Key 61 and XSE, which have 4 gigs of RAM, meaning about 3 gigabytes free. Let's move on. The next important thing to consider is the content bundle that comes with the MPC. There's a lot here that I installed, like the Stage EP, Fabric, Stage Piano, Jura, basically all the Fabric stuff. Unlike the Key 61, which comes with all of these, by default you'll see about half. I'm told that you do get a voucher for one plugin from a selection of a few. I'm not sure all of these are included in that selection. Besides plugin instruments, this also comes with different factory expansions. And then, like I mentioned, I wouldn't call this necessarily content, but Ableton Live Control is at least now missing here. Moving on, another thing that carries weight is how relatively light the Key 37 is. It's 4 kilos or 8.8 pounds, as opposed to double that for the MPC Key 61. Then in terms of pads, these are par for the course for MPCs. These are of the smaller variety, like on the Key 61 and MPC1, as opposed to the bigger pads on the MPC-X and MPC Live. And then in terms of Q-Links, you've got 4 touch encoders with no OLED mini screens, as is the case on all MPCs except the MPC-X, of course, where you've got 16 knobs with little OLED screens to tell you what each knob does, and Force with 8 encoders and mini OLED screens. These 4, of course, represent the 16 knobs on the MPC-X, along with their 5 modes. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons of Key 37 compared to the competition. It competes in 3 overlapping areas: production platforms, synths, and workstations. On the pros side, there's no other synth or workstation that I've seen that has such a comprehensive set of sequencing and production features, certainly not at this competitively low price. Now, Machine, Push 3, and AKAI's own Force give it a good run for its money, but none have a version that's aimed at keyboard players, though of course you could attach a keyboard MIDI controller to them. Beside that, this is an excellent sampler and it has support for multi-sampled instruments. It comes with plenty of built-in synths and sounds and can be expanded with additional content and plugins like excellent pianos and Minimoog and Juno emulators. There's a built-in Mellotron and other instruments, all of which sound great, I think. It also has a controller mode that pairs with the MPC software on a computer, so you can always start things out standalone and then finish things up on your computer with the MPC software and this controlling it. This also has upcoming stem separation functionality, which integrates with the workflow really nicely. And if it doesn't have enough audio or MIDI ports for you, you can expand it with popular class-compliant audio and MIDI interfaces. Finally, all this power is packed in a very compact and light form factor. So what are the cons? I like to separate these to hardware, which won't change, and software, which might. On the hardware side, while it's got more than enough buttons and pads, it's very light on the knob and fader department, certainly compared to other synths and workstations. Now, you can, of course, always connect a MIDI controller to this, but that would require manual mapping. The excellent touchscreen does compensate for this somewhat, so you can edit parameters quickly like this, or move between Q-Link groups and then edit the parameters in the Q-Link groups like this. But certainly 8 or 16 Q-Links like on Force or MPC-X instead of just 4 would have made this a much more tactile experience. On the firmware side, I keep repeating this almost every MPC video, but I still have hopes. It would be great to see a proper clip launching interface as opposed to the way sequences work currently, where the content for all the tracks in a single sequence is bundled together. Now you can start copy pasting between sequences, but an Ableton Live or AKAI Force like clip launch grid would be much better, I think. Beside that, this doesn't have a proper flexible song style arranger like Force. It has a song mode where you can chain sequences, but that's different. And this doesn't support disk streaming like Force does, by the way. Other limits compared to some other instruments are only 8 plugin instruments per project. which you can somewhat work around using key groups and sample tracks. And like I mentioned earlier, only about 1 GB of memory free for plug-in instruments with a lot of samples or key groups with a lot of samples. That's still way more than 64 megabytes on some competitors in this price range, but we have high expectations here, especially since some of the newer plugins that you do need to buy for this, they don't come bundled with it, but with the ones that do come bundled with this, you should be fine. Another limitation here is no seamless sound transitions as you swap between presets. That's an amenity that you get on some workstations. And then some of the sample-based, the heavy ones, sample-based instruments take quite a few seconds to load. These do sound great, by the way, but on other workstations, they load up immediately. That said, you can set up multiple tracks with multiple instruments and then move with seamless transitions from track to track. So that's it for MPC Key 37. Pretty amazing power and value in a very compact form factor. If you like the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.